citizen, same vision is for equal rights and justice for the people them. What's happening to this beautiful world that we're living in? World citizen, lift up your voices.
Welcome everyone to another episode of the People-Powered Planet podcast. Each week we have exciting guests who are solutionaries. Many other people focus on all the incredible, terrible, deep problems of the world. Our focus is on the solutions. How do we, the people, turn these things around and build what Gary Davis called the People-Powered Planet? And today we have a very special opportunity. We have the Nonviolent Peaceforce. Now, my friend David Hartzo, who I knew since high school, and Mel Duncan, they founded this Nonviolent Peaceforce back in 2002. And they went right into action with the Sri Lanka Civil War. There was a peace treaty between the rebel Tamal Tigers and the government forces, and they actually invited the peace team in to help them enforce it, put it together. And so they were key in working with mothers for the return of child soldiers, with accompanying journalists who are under threat to provide protection. And what they found is that when you have an international force, there's a certain power. It's kind of, well, let me put it this way. People used to think that power came out of the barrel of a gun, but we've seen in the world that that's a totally false illusion. The reality is that every time you kill someone, you create more hatred, more anger, more enemies, and it becomes a vicious cycle that never ends. But there's a form of power that's kind of a moral authority. It's representing the will of the people and bringing that moral authority to bear. I was thinking about one time I was driving down the highway, and there was a policeman there with a radar gun. He was standing out in the middle of this highway where people were often going, 50 miles an hour or whatever, and he'd point their gun at him and assume that they're going to stop because he's a policeman, and he did. We would stop. And yet, if we had the force, we had this powerful car, we could have run him over, but it wasn't a matter of might. It was a matter of the moral authority that he was representing. And so the Nonviolent Peaceforce, I think, is the key to how we begin to build an alternative in the future. We've seen UN peacekeepers come up being, the same old thing, warriors killing people, creating enemies sometimes. Now, sometimes the UN has been learning from the Nonviolent Peaceforce. We might get into that in the question, but there are alternative ways of doing things. Now, originally, Mel was going to be with us, but he actually had a very exciting development. He emailed me. He said that he was scheduled. He said, for 2 months, I've been trying to set up a briefing with key people in South Sudan and U.S. aid, and it finally came together just an hour ago. He said, I don't want to lose this date. It could be another 2 months of scheduling a briefing. So he wasn't able to join us today, but Marna, who's going to be on with him, and Kalaya'an are joining us, and we're very appreciative. The Nonviolent Peaceforce has a number of people around the world. We heard from Asha, who's with the Nonviolent Peaceforce, and the amazing situation she had where she actually stepped into a violent conflict and stopped. People are bleeding and in the middle of this tribal war, and she was able to stop the war. So we're very excited to have the two of you today. Welcome. Would you like to start off with telling us a brief overview of the work you're doing at the Nonviolent Peaceforce and how you see that making a key difference in the world?
So I just want to thank you for the opportunity to be here today. Really happy to be able to share with you about the work of Nonviolent Peaceforce. I've been with the organization for almost 6 years, and during that time have really come to appreciate and see the impact of the work of Nonviolent Peaceforce, but mostly it's because of the power of nonviolence and because the way in which we adhere to our values and principles of the organization. So first and foremost, I just want to say that wherever we go because there's been some sort of opening, either an outright invitation from a civil society organization, a government entity, or somebody that's involved in the struggle for peace. And so that's first and foremost. We are truly an international organization. Our board is made up of people from all over the world. Our headquarters are in Geneva. And so I want to emphasize that we're not a US-based organization that works internationally. We're truly an international organization. I happen to work for Nonviolent Peaceforce in the United States, supporting through communications, advocacy, now some program development and fundraising. But we are truly an international organization. We are not a group coming from the global north to fix things for the global south.
That's so important that we get past that attitude, because so often the fixers are the very problem. They're the ones who've created the problem, extracting resources from the third world and leaving many of these countries impoverished. And then when people are angry and strike back, we try to preach to them how to handle it. So much better if we're working side by side with people to overcome the injustices and begin to create change. Can you tell us perhaps a few, as you've been dealing with communications, what are some of the most interesting communications you've received from people in the field who've actually been in the midst of conflicts and been able to make achievements?
Well, all of our achievements, what I wanted to mention was that we always work side by side with community organizations. So for example, working in South Sudan in the what we have the civilian protection sites, for example, and working with the women's protection teams. Those projects came about because a woman, approached one of our peacekeepers and said, you should be training us. We're always in the community. We know what's going on. The men are out fighting or they're out working in the fields. And so we started training women to work in teams of 15 to 25 all throughout the country. We've trained over 2,500 women. Last year, I had the opportunity to be at the 3rd annual conference of women who are doing this work on the ground. And one very concrete example that I think your listeners would want to know about is efforts to protect women when they're leaving these protection sites. So it's basically internal refugee camps, if you will, where every time that the women and girls would leave, they have primary responsibility for feeding the family. They'd leave to get firewood, water, additional food. They were routinely being raped and sexually assaulted. And they approached us and asked if we would consider walking with them. And so one of the key tools that we use is protective accompaniment. And that's more than just going for a walk. We go, our team, a team of about 4, will go out ahead of time, and they will find the armed actors in the field, often from opposing sides, and let them know that they're going to be leading a group of people, women and girls, to get water and firewood, and they want them to stay away from that area. Now, these are sometimes 15-kilometer walks. These are not, you're not walking down the block to get firewood. You're walking up to 15 kilometers. And so it can be an all-day activity. And when we've done those accompaniments, which we've done well over 1,500, nobody's been sexually assaulted or raped. And so what that means is that when you notify people that they're being watched for bad behavior, oftentimes they will change their behavior. And so that is just one example of a tool that we use. And I want to also mention that our teams not only do work in partnership with organizations, our teams are always made up of nationals and internationals and people all along the gender spectrum, right? So we want to model that everybody has a role in building peace in their community, and that there's an interdependence that we have, that the internationals can play a role that the nationals can't play, but the nationals have a different role than the internationals. And that's really the strength of Nonviolent Peaceforce.
Beautiful. That's a beautiful strength, because our strength is in our diversity. So you mentioned the power of observation, just knowing you're being watched. Are your teams also equipped with like GoCams or something else where, sometimes the police have a camera that follows the behavior as well as their verbal reports?
No, not so much. I mean, the accompaniment is just one of the tools that we use. So for example, in places like Iraq, where there's also the displacement camps, sometimes we're doing patrols in the evenings. We started doing night patrols because the Iraqi security was in charge of protecting people within the camp. But there's often, they often had some disputes with people in the camp, so it wasn't making the folks that were living there feeling secure. And so we started doing night patrols where we would just walk along the perimeter and between the housing structures to prevent robberies and sexual assaults. So that's another example of having that presence. But then we get involved in disputes. So there might be, for example, a cattle raid that's brewing in a rural area of South Sudan. And someone will come and say, you know, we hear that this other village is going to come and raid our cattle. Could we bring the elders together and talk about it? So this is one thing we talk about with rumor control. One thing they'll say, well, let's verify if that's true or not. And in some cases, it's not true. It's just that somebody heard that somebody was going to be coming and causing damage or causing harm, because there's this conflict that's always under the surface, right? So, the conflict is there. It's whether or not it turns into violence, right? And so that's one thing we say, conflict is inevitable, violence is not. And so let's verify whether or not the rumors are true. Let's try to back up before we overstep, before we react to a situation. And so that's another example of how we try to bring peace.
Well, that role of verifying truth is so key and such an important thing. I used to work with the American Friends Service Committee, and my daughter heads the, Aura Candidates heads the American Friends Service Committee office in Washington, D.C. And one of their key mottos was speak truth to power. So often the people in power mislead and mislead people by the big lies. And speaking that truth has a great power. And if people get to know that you genuinely speak truth and keep speaking truth, and that you're not manipulating them, they begin to respect that and they begin to change. So there's a power, a truth power that Gandhi talked about. Isn't that Satyagraha? Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think it's something that we certainly could use a lot more of in this country, of people actually stepping back and saying, is what I'm hearing true? Because we tend to dig in based on our beliefs, based on our perspective. We dig into our thoughts and our beliefs and our ideas, and then we see, you know, who we perceive as our enemy, as the problem. And so then we create a whole narrative. And so part of a lot of what our peacekeepers do is they say they have a lot of sweet tea with people, and they sit down and they talk about how can we understand the other perspective.
I think you actually had a key role to play in relation to trying to keep the elections from erupting into violence. Is that right? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So wherever we work, we always do an assessment on the ground first to see if we can work somewhere legally, if it looks like the methods that we have are going to be helpful for the conflict that exists. And so we were stepping into the United States after the murder of George Floyd here in the Twin Cities. And we started to, as we started to make contacts with people, and as former President Trump made the comment to the Proud Boys in his third debate to stand back and stand by, or stand down and stand by. I think there was just a panic in a lot of ways about, we need to try to ensure that these elections are peaceful. So we joined a coalition of probably about 6 other organizations, and we recruited 200 people to be at polling sites. And Nonviolent Peaceforce took on the role of training a number of those folks. And so we were in 30 different polling sites in the Twin Cities, where there's a higher population of people affected by violence and people of BIPOC communities. And to just make sure that people were able to exercise their right to vote without interference. And so that was really the first action that we took in the United States.
Now, is that something you have also done at elections in other countries?
Not exactly like that, but we have partnered with other organizations to be present at polling sites. This was a little bit different, but yes, we work with organizations, for example, to be at food distributions, to make sure there's equal distribution of food, and that people who are most vulnerable, such as elderly folks and pregnant women, also receive the food from the World Food, I can't remember the World Food Organization, I can't remember what it's called right now, from the UN. So that's similar to that type of work that we've done.
Mm-hmm. Well, can you give us a little idea about the breadth and scope of the Nonviolent Peaceforce working? How many countries what are some of the countries you're in, and what are some of the various programs around the world that are helping people build peacekeeping?
So our largest program is in South Sudan, and we have about 160 peacekeepers in South Sudan. And then our next largest is, and one of our older programs is in the Philippines. We work in the area of Mindanao and have about 50 people there. And then in Iraq and Myanmar. So those are the country programs that we're in. And now we've added the United States.
Mm-hmm. And so what kind of impact have you had in Sudan? What do you see as the problem and the solution there, and how are you playing a key role in it?
One of the things that our executive director talks about, Tiffany Easton, which she'll talk about a lot, is that intercommunal violence will sometimes bubble up. So you have kind of the violence at a national level that affects what's happening to communities at a communal level, and then the communal level also affects the national. And so we are often working, our folks live and work in the communities, right? And so they are involved in situations like cattle raids, like I had mentioned. They are helping to negotiate peaceful resolution of conflicts between small villages. And then they're also really working at this national level. I think the work that we've done with women to create these women's protection teams is really, really important. I mean, to have 2,500 women in South Sudan that are working together, and they have, they wear the same, they'll wear, when they're working together, wear kind of these bright pink shirts, so they identify themselves as peacekeepers for their community. They get involved in situations of domestic violence, and they intervene in those cases, make sure that people have the resources they need if they're assaulted. They meet with the elders, they're challenging some of those gender norms of the country about speaking up. And so some of those impacts, we see the impact in terms of, getting people the safety that they need after a situation of individual violence. Then we also see it at the national level when we're coordinating with the United Nations, we're coordinating with all the other humanitarian aid organizations and having a seat at the table about how to address different issues that communities are facing.
So tell me a little bit more about some very specific cases in Sudan. Like what do you see as the, why is there a war in Sudan? And what is the key to turning that around? And what is the Nonviolent Peaceforce's role in that?
Well, South Sudan is one of might be the youngest country in the world. And after they gained independence from Sudan, two of the primary leaders of those opposition that started to fight with one another. So you really have two autocrats, one who's Dinka and one who's Nuer, who ethnicized their conflict. And suddenly you saw communities that may have coexisted peacefully prior, who identified as Dinka or identified as Nuer, started to fight with one another. And so they have finally put in place, after many delays, a peace agreement, and they formed a unity government about a year, I guess it was in February 2020. I was there in March, just before the pandemic shut everything down. And the unity government was trying to encourage people who had fled the country during the war to return, saying it's safe to return now. I met with a group of South Sudanese who had fled to the Congo, and we met kind of on the border of the Congo and learned about their situation. And they wanted to return home, but we feel like they were returning home to nothing. So you have extreme poverty, you have drought in some areas, you have flooding in other areas, you have a lot that this government needs to take responsibility for in terms of, and overcome. The last time I talked to the head of our mission there, felt like the peace is really stalled in South Sudan. Nonviolent Peaceforce, we don't have one solution to that. I think what we try to do is really to continue to model how nonviolence and understanding one another's perspective can actually lead to greater peace. And so that's what we do through our trainings and through our work with partnerships. So we also work for specific examples, all the, you know, the youth that we work with in some areas who have only seen a response to violence with more violence. And so some of our peacekeepers work with youth groups in the country to try to model and talk with them about other options. And so it's just training, but it's also, you know, getting them out and forming teams and playing soccer with one another and trying to build up the trust between one another, people from different tribes and different clans, so that they can start to model that and see that there is another way forward.
Sounds really uplifting. I noticed we have Barbara Mueller on the call as well, who heads the Rotary E Club of World Peace, and they had a fascinating speaker last night on their weekly meetings from Harvard, who was talking about Richardson, who was talking about that very often in these various conflicts, you know, we from the West look at them as, oh, that's these local people have this problem, this group doesn't like that group, but yet very often at the core of it is the resource extraction that's been done over the years systematically by an economic system dominated by the powers that are looking for their oil and their all the incredible mineral richness that these countries that are so impoverished are actually the richest countries in the world, rich with incredible mineral resources that are not benefiting the local population, but that are being extracted and are creating that breeding grounds for the total chaos, a lack of resources to build a decent society that are leading and erupting into these local conflicts. Do you see that playing a role as you're observing what's going on in Sudan?
Absolutely, we see that. You know, one thing that we have been talking about as an organization is how do we make sure that we are an organization that is not replicating a colonial mindset, that we are really an anti-racist organization, and we're anti-colonialism. And so we get into a lot of those conversations. We also see, when you mention the natural resources, we're also seeing climate disruption, and that's its impact on conflict. The number of people that are having to flee their homes because of drought. In South Sudan, flooding has just been terrible the last few years, and cattle have died. And so when you know, communities show their wealth through their cattle, which is why you have young boys who are armed guarding the cattle. They're the cattle keepers. This last year, there was about, I think it was about 75% of the country was flooded. And so that results in a lot of cattle loss, which means your wealth is lost. And so then after that cycle, we see a real uptick in violence. And so we're working on our strategic plan right now. And one of the key areas that we want to incorporate is looking at the impact of climate disruption on conflict and bringing that into what does that mean about the partnerships that will form? What's the role of nonviolence in disrupting conflict when it's really related at its root to ongoing climate disruption?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm so glad you brought up the climate disruption. We're heading toward Earth Month when we're going to actually be having our film, The World is My Country, on public television stations across the US. And Earth Month is so key to all of this. One of the things that excited me about developing this podcast and working on Gary Davis's vision of the people-powered planet is that it somehow integrates both this variety of problems and solutions. And that is that the key reason why we haven't been able to get control of the climate and why when so many people in the world want a different kind of world, want peace, want security for their kids, don't really want to go bombing other countries and all this, and why it's not happening is because of a broken political system where we're locked in these boxes called nation states. And if we try to like regulate the pollution of a company, they say, okay, well, we'll just go elsewhere. Or if they try to, if you try to tax them or whatever. And so therefore, instead of the people being on top, as it originally was when corporations were set up in Thomas Jefferson's day, and they had a 20-year charter that could be pulled if they weren't serving the public interest, because we, the people, are in those boxes, and they're operating globally, the forces of money and power have kind of taken over control of the world. And it's kind of even out of their control. Even if a leader of a big company wants to do good for the environment, he's driven by the profit imperative to do things that are destructive that he feels bad about later when he's talking to his grandkids. And yet this is what he had to do because he's stuck in that role. And I think one of the things that we're working on here is how to shake people out of that thinking and to give them that power that we have when we think of ourselves as governors of this small planet rather than the governed. You know, every constitution and the Declaration of Independence said the will of the people, that it is the right of the people to institute new government, and the UDHR, the basis of government, it's the will of the people shall serve as the basis of government. So do you see a way that in the work that you're doing, we can begin to emerge, begin to evolve a grassroots power of democracy that where we come together, the various people working on these various elements, and you're an international organization, are kind of coming together at a level where we can begin to evolve a better way of running our world?
Well, I think I would like to pivot a little bit because I think that speaks really clearly to what's happening in the United States with the movement against racial injustice in terms of looking at how to really challenge power structures. And so I would love to have Kalaya'an talk a little bit about our US programs.
Great, let's do
that question.
Great.
Sure, thank you so much for having us on. So as we've seen, at least in the last 4 years, there has been an uptick of white supremacist violence, both from the state and non-state actors. Nonviolent Peaceforce is really committed into building the capacity of communities on the ground to be able to keep themselves safe from violence. And this looks like a whole bunch of different ways. But there's two primary kind of approaches that we're piloting currently in the Twin Cities. One is with protest community safety teams. These are folks that are on the ground at actions that are able to support through protective accompaniment, protective presence, de-escalation, and our other methodologies around unarmed civilian protection. And we are also looking at neighborhood community protection teams. And these are folks that are either doing foot patrols or building communications infrastructure within neighborhoods to be able to identify if there is, for instance, back in May, there were reports of white supremacists coming into Minneapolis. One of them was charged with starting the fire at, I believe, the first precinct. So communities are rightly afraid, especially after what we saw on January 6th in the Capitol. But what we want to do is to be able to show the community that they have the skills and the ability to keep themselves safe. What we're trying to provide is the training, the deepening of the skills, whether that is on situational awareness, whether that's on one of our UCP methodologies, or identifying kind of tactical safety and security methods in protecting their communities against state and non-state actor violence. So it's this past, on March 8th, this past Monday, we were on the ground here in the Twin Cities in downtown Minneapolis for the first day of the Derek Chauvin trial. We had 31 protest community safety team members on the ground, and we had a whole host of folks that were doing remote research and support from the office. One thing that we're hoping to do is really bring these methodologies that are co-built and co-created with our partners in the Global South here in the Global North. Because if there's one thing that we've seen over and over again in this, at least in this last year, is that we cannot wholly rely on the government to keep us safe. Communities, most especially marginalized communities, know best about what solutions they need in order to keep their communities safe from state and non-state actor violence. And our role as Nonviolent Peaceforce is to support that capacity, support that, that deep community-based wisdom, to center their needs and to build safety through nonviolent means and through unarmed civilian protection methodologies in the Twin Cities and beyond.
Well, that's so important. And I want to ask you one more question before I throw it open to our audience for other questions. And everyone can come on and put your questions in the chat, and I'll throw that open to Melanie. But before I do, okay, so you're working on protection of the protesters from external, like maybe dealing with the police and kind of when they face them. And I assume you're sort of like a barrier. Maybe you can explain that more.
Sure.
But also then what do you do about, one of the key things Gandhi talked about is that the need for the whole group to stay nonviolent. How do you keep members of the protest group from inciting violence themselves by not by taking a violent action which provokes the police?
Well, so what we do is we protect all unarmed civilians, regardless of whether they're protesters, bystanders, or just people that are in the area. So in many instances, what our teams do is to use situational awareness to identify if a conflict is going to turn into violence, and to figure out what is a best methodology and approach to cooling down the situation. When we do trainings on de-escalation, one central thing is you can only de-escalate yourself and those whom you are in right relationship to. We cannot de-escalate the police, but we can de-escalate our people. And that all means that is primarily due to the relationship we have with folks on the ground. And what we try to do is to either offer a different way forward, but we do not police, we facilitate safety in spaces on the ground. Our primary focus is protecting people from bodily harm and violence against them. So that means whether that's someone holding a Black Lives Matter poster or someone that's holding a Trump 2021 poster, as long as they are unarmed civilians in a conflict, it's our job to be able to protect and keep them safe from violence from state and non-state actors.
Okay, well now I'm about to turn it over to Melanie for questions, but we did have one of our members, Abdul, asked me in advance if we could post his question, and Melanie has done it. He's in Pakistan and he's working with kids at the poorest level of the society, and it's kind of amazing that he's able to reach out in this way and join us. And he specifically he talked about how much he appreciated and saluted the work you're doing at the Nonviolent Peaceforce, and he said he's very worried about violence. He said, and I'm thankful to you, madam, that he's just asked if you could communicate with him. He said, I want to learn new things in my life. I must work for all human rights. I hope, madam, that you should support me and all leaders of the Nonviolent Peaceforce, because we're all humans equal in the world, and as human beings. We must first of all work to create happiness for all humans and to create a good environment with a better education being a fundamental right for all. So I guess the particular question there is, and then Melanie can take the rest of the questions, how can you help a particular person on the ground wanting to work in this area in Pakistan, for example?
Well, we get, as you can imagine, we get requests from a lot of different places, more than we can actually take on. So, but as Kalaya'an had mentioned, we support groups on the ground that are already doing this work. There's a lot of ways in which communities are already working to protect themselves. And so, for example, we have online training. It's an unarmed civilian protection. That's a 5-week training that we have actually made available in the last 2 years to African youth. It's called Silencing the Guns Initiative. And that was actually funded in part from members of the UN, member states of the UN. So we can do some of that remote support. In order for us to actually initiate a new program is quite a, I wouldn't say lengthy process, because we know that there's times when we want to be able to activate and mobilize more quickly because of what's happening on the ground. But we really, as I mentioned earlier, we really have to make sure that we have people that we will partner with that are invested in using unarmed civilian protection methodologies. We need to make sure we can work there legally. We need to make sure that there's some funding sources for us to put people on the ground. So there's a lot that goes into actually determining when we're going to act to go into a new country program. But you know, anybody, I'm happy to take. We do have an email address, and he can reach out as well.
Thank you. And Melanie, so now I'll turn it over to you for other questions.
Thank you, Arthur, and thank you, Marna and Kalaya'an. Your incredible work is so impressive, and we're so honored to have you here. We do have some questions from our audience members, and I would like to first go to Claire. Claire, if you could please unmute your mic and ask your question.
I discovered that in 2018, United Nations wrote a list of 24 recommendations for peacekeeping. I was wondering if you use those. It's about learning the language of who you're working with and nonviolent ways of communicating and things like that.
So I haven't read those. I can tell you how we operate. So we do, as I mentioned, we usually work in teams. We certainly encourage, well, first of all, I'll just back up. Our folks go through about a 10-day mission preparedness training where they are learning how to de-escalate situations. They're learning about all the different methods that we use on unarmed civilian protection, and really being trained to be able to understand all perspectives to a conflict. We work in teams of nationals and internationals, so there's a real interdependence there. So I cannot tell you that all of our internationals speak the local language, but they work in the pairs with a national staff to help with interpretation of the cultural expectations as well as language. We certainly do have some international staff who have learned local languages. But I think probably most importantly is our work is rooted in trust building relationships rather than threat of force or use of force, which is different than the UN. So the UN peacekeepers are armed missions. They are looking to do a pilot project using unarmed civilian protection methods in South Sudan, where they can start to compare the difference between the two, and we'll be working with them on that pilot project because they're starting to see the effectiveness of an unarmed approaches. So it's a different, it's really a whole different approach than the UN has in terms of it's really, we're really rooted in relationships.
And Arthur put up a heart. Yes, that's key. That's key. That makes the difference. Yes. So we now would like to go to Mike Caruso. Please unmute yourself if you could.
Question for both Kalaya'an and Marna. One relating to operations in North America and also in the third world. Do you find yourself working with other organizations like the UN High Commission for Civil Rights or American Friends Service Committee or Voices for Creative Nonviolence or Doctors Without Borders or Mediators Without Borders or possibly even Rotary clubs?
Yes, I would say yes to all of those. So we have, we've been actually for our work here in the US, we've been in communication quite a bit with Mediators Beyond Borders. In South Sudan, one of our offices is located down the street from Doctors Without Borders. So we do have good relationships. Whoever local partners are that are either offering humanitarian assistance, who are working in the peace process, we are trying to find a way, as we said, building relationships with all the different partners so that we have a very good understanding of how to move ahead together. And we do work with Rotary, absolutely. And I see Ann Frisch is on the call, and she has been our primary contact to Rotary.
There's the direct relationships and also indirect. When I was at Amnesty International USA, building out the Human Rights Observer Program, we constantly referred to NP's unarmed civilian protection methodologies and approach in the way that we would show up in either Standing Rock, Ferguson, the RNC, DNC, and in any other deployments. So there is the active relationships and also the passive relationships and the kind of like the passive resource sharing that NP does.
That's great that you work together with so many different organizations, and we appreciate all this wonderful information. And I wanted to ask any other last questions we could slip in before we go back to Arthur. Just let me know and we can come back. We'll go back to Arthur for now. So back to you, Arthur.
You mentioned Rotary, Mike, and I think that is really key. We were thrilled that that with the help of Shekhar Mehta, the new Rotary International President-elect, that he loved our film, The World Is My Country, and helped us get officially approved by Rotary, putting a salute to Rotary at the opening of the film that will help us reach out to Rotarians around the country to join in it. And Rotary is really doing crucial work in communities all over the world to do peace building and to help people in so many ways with services. And it's good to see them beginning to shift from just services to also empowering people toward peace building. So I do invite everyone to come to the worldismycountry.com/Rotary and connect with them. Maybe you could say a little more specifically about whether there are ways that you see cooperating, particularly with Rotary groups. Is that something that you've been aware of?
Yeah, you know, we've had, I think, about 14 folks that work with Nonviolent Peaceforce who have been Rotary Fellows. Asha, who was here recently, was one of the fellows. And so that has been a really good connection. I was at the World Peace Forum last January, at the Rotary Peace Conference, and made a lot of great connections. And so we're looking at, I was all ready to join my local Rotary when pandemic happened, so that has not happened. But I think looking at, you know, particularly now that we're working in the United States, I think there might be some opportunity for collaboration with local Rotary. And then we're also looking at Rotary International and how they might be able to support our work and make some connections.
That's fabulous. We have Barbara Mueller on the phone, and since you wanted to join your local Rotary, this is a perfect opportunity to join the Rotary E-Club of World Peace, because it's continued all through the pandemic, never skipped a beat, because we're all working virtually as we are in the meeting here today. I see a question that came in the chat from Claire, where she asked, do you meet with police before attending a demonstration?
Yeah, I'd be glad to answer that. We meet with all armed actors as much as we possibly can. For the situation here in Minneapolis, we sent a letter of notification to the Sheriff's Department, and I had a meeting with their outreach officer to inform them of who we are, what we're doing on the ground, and what we're going to be looking like. Just like how we operate in Myanmar, the Philippines, Iraq, and Sudan, we're utilizing that similar approach here with regards to armed actors.
And how do the police respond when you suggest when you talk to them?
They're pretty cordial. I mean, like, they really just want to understand like who's going to be on the ground, what kind of like safety resources are different groups going to be bringing. So yeah, they were pretty open to knowing kind of like what our purpose was.
I'd like to jump in with a question that just came in. Mike if you'd like to unmute and ask your question.
Yes, thank you. I've been involved in the recreation field for most of my life, and I'll date myself, but back in the 70s, there was a group called the New Games Foundation that used play to bring people of diverse backgrounds together. And I'm wondering if the speakers feel that play would have a place as a strategy in peacekeeping or bringing people together.
You know, I think that does, particularly with youth that we've been working with in South Sudan. We have had what we refer to as child-friendly spaces as well that are associated with the civilian protection sites, where it gives parents a break. They know that their kids will be safe, and it gives them an opportunity to play and to try to be kids for a little bit, even though they're living in a really traumatizing situation and unsettling situation. So we do see the importance of that. I would say it has been focused on youth. When I was in South Sudan last year, though, just between breaks of the sessions, the women would start dancing and singing together, and it was just so beautiful. And so joyful. And I think that, they incorporate that on their own in so many wonderful ways that I observed in the time that I was there. I think we could learn a lot from that kind of way of viewing the world and experiencing joy together.
I love that, dancing and singing as part of the joy and power of nonviolence. And I have the thrill of when I was in Lithuania, of meeting with the leader of the singing revolution, who helped actually be the first state to break away from the Soviet Union and lead to that breakup. And it was incredible. I mean, here was a country that had been brutally suppressed by the Soviet Union, and yet when all the people joined together and singing and faced the tanks and so on, and they were singing the patriotic songs that the tank drivers all knew and so on, they couldn't crush them. There were like 17 people killed instead of the hundreds or thousands they would have had in a violent revolution, and they wouldn't have succeeded. There's an incredible power to singing, and maybe there's unless there's other questions to jump in, maybe you have some other examples of the power of song and the arts in helping to turn around violence and to be a nonviolent peace force.
Well, my late husband was Assistant Secretary General at the United Nations, and he would make speeches, but it's when he played his harmonica that the souls opened up, and he played a 10-hole harmonica with Ode to Joy. But I have a question for you in addition to that, because I admire your work so much. I'm Barbara Mueller, president of the Rotary E-Club of World Peace. Do join us. We really love to have you join us. Rotary E-Club of worldpeace.org. 6:30 Pacific time every Tuesday night. But situational awareness really got me. How do you know what's going on? Do you know before, in the middle, or after? And some of these situations are just so hard to even watch, let alone get involved in. I don't know how you do it. Do you all meditate? You have to do something to stay calm.
Love that, Barbara. Go ahead.
Meditation does play a key in it. Well, actually, mindfulness really plays a key in it. When we do
present, right?
I'm sorry?
Being present.
Exactly. When we do trainings on situational awareness, we go through what's called the OODA loop. It's observe, orient, decide, and act. Once again, that's observe, orient, decide, and act. If you go onto our website, nonviolentpeaceforce.org, we actually have kind of like a rundown on how folks can utilize that in any kind of situation where potential violence might arise. Really what it's about is it's a cognitive shortcut when you're pushed out of your window of tolerance, for you to be able to kind of fall back on. So you want to observe and take in as much information as possible. You want to orient and create baselines that help you identify anomalies. You want to decide, which helps you come up with a plan. And then you want to act, which is just taking decisive action. And this might seem very common sense, but as we know, when we're put in a high stress or hyper aroused state, it's easy for us to kind of like shut down. So it's important for us to have a fallback to be able to navigate the situation. And we provide this tool to through trainings, but also move our participants through a threat assessment. What are the likely threats on the horizon? What are the risks or harms to yourself? What are the vulnerabilities that yourself or your community has? And what are the capacities or resources that you need and you have?
I love that. I love UDA because it's so important to be able to have that anchor in a conflict. We developed another acronym called Bullyproof. It's a 10-step program for non-violently handling conflicts with potential bullies. And it's at bullyproof.org or bullyproof.com. And we had a conflict resolution expert trained at George Mason University who said, whenever I'd get into a conflict, all my training would go right out the window, and I had to use your Bullyproof to anchor it. B, how can I bust out of this conflict and come out of it a different way? U, can I really understand what is triggering my hot buttons and the other person? And L, love the doer but not the deed. Look for the good. Bullyproof, you can look it up. But having an anchor of an acronym that even in a conflict you can call on is great. So I'll remember that. UDA, I like it.
And I wrote the book Revolutionary Conversations to have the success you want. Simple steps like stop, help, ask a question, relate. Stop, help, ask, risk, and explore. These are simple steps that people forget them under tragedy situations and violence. And violence is prevalent because there's a lot of unhappiness now, and they don't know how to take care of that part of them that isn't getting the nurturing it needs. So I imagine after everything is said and done, you must have to nurture the people who are helping you at times just so that you can go forward. Talk about that a little bit, how you help these people survive these moments of deep despair.
Yeah, I can mention that. We just a couple of years ago started doing more surveys of our employees to see how they're coping, what additional resources they need, and then how they're feeling once they leave the field. So we do ask our folks to try to make a 2-year commitment, which is a significant commitment of time. And some people stay much, much longer, and some don't quite make it 2 years. They decide that after a time that's not really where they want to be working, and that's fine because it is really stressful. And so we have kind of an employee assistance program set up for kind of remote counseling and remote support for people that are working in the field. We also have pretty strict R&R requirements. And so people that are working in remote areas, for example, in South Sudan, are required to take a week off. I think it's every 8 weeks or something. And to get away, they're not allowed to stay in the field, at least to go to Juba, or ideally to go somewhere where they can really relax and get away from the tension and the violence. And we also, our folks go home once a year, and that's part of their salary. So I don't know, I want to make sure that everybody knows that, we don't have volunteers in the field, we have staff. So we have about 300 people who are doing this work. And so we want to build that out. We have a new human resources director in Geneva, and we're really looking at what we need to do, how we need to enhance that aspect of our work so that people don't go home damaged.
Are you finding more work in the United States than ever before?
I don't know than ever before, because we have never, stepped into the space before, right? I mean, we're a country that is
peaceful, so-called.
We're a country that is founded on violence, and therefore is, extremely, extremely violent in so many different ways. So people have asked us for a long time to come here, and so I feel really, really proud and really honored, I guess, to be helping in some small way to bring this forward.
So first of all, this is really key. I want to especially give a salute to David Hartsough. He is going to actually do a podcast with us. David has been a key person in helping to build peace in the world. I first met him when he was part of and coming back from this San Francisco to Moscow peace march against nuclear weapons way back in the 60s. And he's been really key in founding both this organization and World Beyond War. And he again is, we're going to be having him shortly as a podcast guest, even though he is currently struggling with cancer. But I'm confident that with someone with his great spirit, it will all work out in the end. I also am very grateful to have you talking with us about the Nonviolent Peace Force. It was something that Gary talked about. He talked about the idea of having these world guards that would be like UN peacekeepers, but they would use nonviolent means like you're doing. And one of the key things I want to ask is, how can people support what you're doing? How can they go to your website and both utilize your resources? And if it's totally a staff organization, you must need funds. What are ways people here can be a part of that, can help encourage others to be a part of it, and can help you in this important mission in the world?
Yeah, well, I do think thank you for asking that. I do think going to our website and reading some of the stories will be really inspiring for you. So I'd encourage you to do that. We obviously have a donate page and a donate button on every page. As there's lots of ways to give. And then we often will do through our social media channels. So if you like us on Facebook and if you follow us on Twitter, you'll see some opportunities for engagement campaigns where we ask people to send messages of encouragement to folks that we're working with in places like South Sudan and Iraq. That means a lot to our staff. And so that's just another way that you can engage. And I think talking with others about the impact of unarmed approaches to protecting people. We need to continue to spread the word that the presence of weapons escalates violence, right? And it just perpetuates this belief that the only way to resolve conflict is through the use of force or threat of force. And it takes all of us talking about another vision to spark people's imagination that truly there is a different way that will work. If you haven't read Erica Chenoweth's book called Why Civil Resistance Works, I would encourage you to pick that up as well. She did a study from looking at conflicts from, I think, 1900 to 1994 or something, looking at ones that use violence and ones that use nonviolence, and found that nonviolent campaigns were twice as likely to achieve the desired goals as violent campaigns. And they lead to democratic institutions more frequently than violent campaigns. So
wow.
I would encourage you to pick that book up as well. It's called Why Civil Resistance Works.
Wow, that is so key, having that study and to know that kind of impact. And I'm thrilled that your program in Sudan is so effective that the UN is having to say, wait a minute, do we really need to put all this money into these armed weapons and guards when these people are doing better without them? Let's scratch our heads a little bit. Let's think this thing through. Let's take a look at what they're doing and try out a model project. So the fact that you're not only talking about this, but you're actually doing it and doing it in a way that can inspire the people who currently have a lot of funds for peacekeeping, but are misusing it, or not misusing, but not knowing this incredible power you're talking about. Helping that awareness is great, and I'm glad you're helping that. And I think if people can contribute to that and to helping spread that awareness, that would be wonderful.
One more plug, if you go to, we've been having what we call nonviolence cafes. We've been doing them for about a year since the pandemic started. And our last one, it's number 11. If you go to our website and you click on, there's a bar at the top, it says, listen to our Nonviolence Cafe series. If you go to number 11, we had a really, really fabulous one where we had a South Sudanese man, Rocky, who now works in Iraq for us, talk about how this works on the ground. And he was paired with a man named Kazu Haga, who is author of a book called Healing Resistance and the founder of the East Point Peace Academy in Oakland, California. And the subject was, how do we move ahead and during such a time of great political divide? And Kazu does just such a wonderful description of how trauma lives in our bodies, and how we need, in order to really become a nonviolent society, we really need to work through our individual trauma and our collective trauma. So I think it's really valuable and really speaks to, Barbara, what you were mentioning.
We could keep you on forever.
Thank you so much to all our wonderful guests and all of our participants here, and to Tom for running the YouTube Live. I wanted to remind everybody to let everyone know that there is this whole program every week is live on YouTube. And if you go to our YouTube channel and subscribe, that's a great way to let others know. Not everyone wants to necessarily join our club or put in their email. So if they don't want to, they can still watch it free right there on YouTube. Well, thank you, all of you. This is very heartwarming to be here with you. Please join us next week, same time, 10 a.m. Pacific, but your local time zone, check it out. And each week we have exciting guests talking about how together we build the people-powered planet.
World citizen, lift up your voices. Oh, you know we got something to say. All we need is the same directions, heading in one way.